She was the woman no one would touch. Not to hire, not to house, not even to look at without curling their lip. He was the man who hadn't spoken a kind word to anyone in 3 years. The day Colt Mercer rode into Silver Creek looking for a housekeeper, he found something the whole town had already thrown away. And when he loaded her onto his wagon and drove her back to his ranch, in front of every judging eye on Main Street, nobody believed it would last a week. They were wrong. Drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me, because what happens next will stay with you long after the credits roll. The morning Colt Mercer decided to ride into town, the sky was the color of an old bruise, gray and purple and swollen at the edges, threatening snow that hadn't fallen yet but was absolutely coming. He stood on his porch for a long moment, coffee going cold in his hand, staring out at the land that stretched in every direction like it owned him instead of the other way around. 4,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, 11 ranch hands who ate his food, slept in his bunkhouse, and did their work without complaint. And not a single warm thing inside the house behind him. He set the coffee down on the railing, didn't finish it, hadn't finished a cup of coffee in probably 2 years, and went to Saddle Duke. The ride into Silver Creek took 40 minutes on a good day. Today, with the wind cutting sideways off the mountains and Duke fighting the bit like he could smell the coming cold, it took closer to an hour. Colt didn't mind. He wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere in particular. He was just in a hurry to get out of that house. Silver Creek had grown in the last few years. What had been a rough scatter of tents and timber frames when Colt first arrived in the territory had become something that almost resembled permanence. A main street with a proper general store, a livery, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse 3 days a week, and enough residences clustered around the edges that a man couldn't sneeze without 3 neighbors knowing about it by supper time. Colt hated that part. He tied Duke outside Henderson's general store and pushed through the door, nodding at Walt Henderson behind the counter without stopping to talk. He needed salt, flour, coffee beans, and to put the word out that he was looking for someone to manage the house. His ranch hands were good men, but none of them could cook anything that didn't taste like boot leather, and the house itself had accumulated a layer of neglect that had gone from embarrassing to genuinely concerning. Last week he'd found a mouse nest in his spare bedroom. He hadn't told anyone. "Mercer," Walt called after him as he moved toward the back shelves. "You hear about the situation over at the Calloway place?" "Nope." "That woman they took in? The Hart woman? She's gone. Mabel Calloway sent her off day before yesterday." Colt reached for a 50-pound sack of flour and didn't look up. "Not my business." "Well, it might be if you're still looking for help at the ranch. I know you mentioned it last month." Colt straightened slowly and looked at Walt. Walt was a decent man. Not a gossip exactly, but not immune to it either. He had the expression of someone who was trying to be helpful while also holding on to information that he found entertaining. "Who's the Hart woman?" Colt asked. Walt leaned on the counter. "Evelyn Hart. Came out from Ohio. Or maybe it was Pennsylvania. I can't keep it straight. About 6 months ago. Was supposed to marry a fellow named Douglas Crane. You know him. Runs the feed operation over on the East End." "I know of him. Well, turns out Crane brought her all the way out here, let her believe they were getting married, and then—" Walt paused for effect in the way that people do when they're enjoying the story more than they should. "Turned out he already had a wife. Back in Missouri. Had her for 8 years. Colt stared at him. He brought a woman out to the territory knowing he had a wife somewhere. That's about the size of it. What happened to him? Walt waved a hand. "Oh, the wife back in Missouri doesn't want any part of it. Won't travel out here. Crane's still running his business like nothing happened. Sheriff looked into it, but there wasn't much that could be done legally, far as he could tell. Crane claims the whole thing is a misunderstanding, which is the kind of thing a man says when he's got no shame left to lose." Colt said nothing. He picked up the flour sack and moved it to the growing pile near the door. "Anyway," Walt continued, "Evelyn Hart has been trying to find work ever since. The Calloways took her in for a few weeks as a kitchen helper, but Mabel, you know Mabel, she got to worrying about what the neighbors would think, having someone with that kind of story under her roof, so she let her go." "What kind of story?" Colt asked. Not because he was particularly interested, but because something in the way Walt said it made him want to hear the rest. Walt shifted on his feet. "Well, that's just it. It's not so much what she did, it's what people decided she must have done. You know how it goes. A woman arrives in town attached to a man like Crane, and then it comes out he's married, and suddenly he shrugged with the practiced helplessness of a man who disapproves of something but won't bother fighting it. People start wondering what she knew and when she knew it, whether she was respectable in the first place, whether she's the kind of woman who— "Where is she now?" Colt said. Walt blinked. "Pardon?" "The Heart Woman. Where is she right now?" "Far as I know, she's been staying at the back room of the church. Reverend Thomas let her sleep there, but he told her she'd need to move on by end of the week. His wife isn't comfortable with—" "Thank you, Walt." Colt set his remaining supplies on the counter and reached for his coin purse. "Add these to my account." He walked out before Walt could say anything else. He found her around the side of the church, in the narrow alley between the building and the woodpile, splitting logs with an axe that was slightly too large for her frame and working at it with the furious concentration of someone who had run out of better options. She was younger than he expected, mid-20s maybe, though there was something around her eyes that added years the same way hard weather ages timber. Brown hair pulled back under a wool hat that had seen better days, a coat that wasn't warm enough for October in the mountains. She swung the axe in a clean arc, and the log split, and she kicked the pieces aside and set up the next one without pausing. Colt stood at the entrance to the alley and watched for a moment. She noticed him after the third log. She straightened, set the axe head down in the dirt, and looked at him with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite fear. It was something in between, the look of a person who has been surprised by bad news enough times that they've stopped being surprised by it. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "I'm Colt Mercer," he said. "I have a ranch about 40 minutes northeast of town. I know who you are." She didn't say it unfriendly, just factual. "What do you want?" He considered several ways to say it and settled on the most direct. "I heard you're looking for work. I need someone to manage the house at my ranch. Cooking, cleaning, keeping things organized. It's not light work." She studied him. "Who told you I was looking for work?" "Walt Henderson." "Of course." She said it without heat, but her jaw moved in a way that suggested she was biting back something more. "Did he tell you everything else while he was at it?" "He told me about Crane," Colt said. Something flickered across her face. Not shame exactly, more like a person bracing for the follow-up, for the part where he would say but and tell her why the situation made her unsuitable. Colt didn't say but. "The pay is $12 a month," he said. "Room and board included. You'd have your own space. We have a small room off the kitchen that's been used for storage. I can have it cleaned out. It's not fancy, but it's private and it's warm." She stared at him. "That's—" She stopped, started again. "You don't know anything about me." "I know what Henderson told me." "Then you know what people in this town think about me." "I know what people in this town think about a lot of things," Colt said. "I generally don't find it useful information." She looked down at the axe in her hands, then back at him. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes. The same calculation any person makes when they've been hungry enough times that distrust starts to feel like a luxury they can't afford. "Your wife," she said carefully. "She'd need to be comfortable with the arrangement. My wife died 4 years ago," Colt said. The words came out the same way they always came out when he had to say them. Flat, factual, a door shut firmly against whatever was behind it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. He could tell. "So," he said, "do you want the job or not?" She looked at him for a long moment. The wind pushed through the alley, rustling the woodpile and lifting a strand of hair across her face. She tucked it back under her hat. "Why?" she asked. He frowned. "Why what?" "Why would you hire me? You know what people will say. You know they'll talk. You have a reputation in this town. People respect you. Why would you risk that by bringing someone like me onto your property?" It was a fair question. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, without a lot of ceremony, looking for the plainest, honest answer. "Because my house is a mess," he said. "My cook quit 2 months ago, and my hands are eating canned beans 4 nights a week. And because the work needs doing regardless of what people think about the person doing it." She looked at him for another beat. Then she set the axe carefully against the woodpile, pulled off her work gloves, and tucked them into her coat pocket. "When do I start?" she said. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, more the quiet of two people who have each decided to reserve judgment and are waiting to see what comes next. Evelyn sat on the wagon seat beside him with her small trunk loaded in the back, her hands folded in her lap, watching the land roll out around them as Silver Creek disappeared behind the tree line. "You can ask," she said eventually. Colt kept his eyes on the road. "Ask what?" "Whatever you're wondering. About Crane, about how I ended up here. Everyone asks eventually, one way or another. I'd rather have it done." He considered that. "What I wonder about is whether you can cook a decent pot roast. Everything else is your own business." She turned to look at him. He could feel it without looking. "I can cook a pot roast," she said. "Good." They rode another mile in silence. "Ohio," she said, unprompted. "Walt Henderson had it right. I'm from a town called Millbrook, about 60 miles east of Columbus. My father was a school teacher. My mother died when I was 11. I have two older brothers who—" She stopped. Her hands tightened briefly in her lap and then relaxed. "They made it very clear when everything with Crane came out that they didn't want me coming back home, that the situation was an embarrassment to the family." Colt said nothing. "I wrote them twice," she said. No answer. He kept his eyes on the road. Duke's breath came in white puffs in the cold air, and the wagon wheels cut clean tracks through the frost on the ground. "I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy," Evelyn said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but there was effort behind it, the effort of a person who has decided that dignity is the one thing they're not going to surrender. "I'm telling you because you should know what you've taken on. I have nowhere to go back to. This job isn't a temporary arrangement for me. If it doesn't work out, if you decide I'm not what you need, or if the talk from town creates too many problems, I'm not sure what I do next." Now Colt did look at her. She was looking straight ahead, chin slightly elevated, not asking for anything with her expression. She'd stated a fact. That was all. "Then I suppose," he said, "we'd both better make sure it works out." She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased just slightly, the way a person exhales when they've been holding their breath and finally decide it's safe to breathe. The ranch came into view as they crested the last hill. A cluster of buildings set against the mountains, the main house larger than most in the territory, built solid from timber and stone by men who intended it to last. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. A couple of hands were moving around the corral fence with tools. "It's bigger than I expected," Evelyn said. "Been adding to it for 10 years. Did your wife—" She stopped. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "She helped design the house," Colt said. He said it simply, without making a production of it. "She wanted a kitchen with 2 windows, said she'd go mad cooking in a dark room." Evelyn nodded once. The wagon rolled down the hill toward the house, and as it did, 3 ranch hands materialized in various states of curiosity near the fence. Colt recognized their expressions. Not hostile exactly, but wary. Men who had learned to be careful about new developments on a ranch that had been running a particular way for a long time. The biggest one, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard named Pete Grady, walked up to the wagon as Colt pulled Duke to a stop. "Boss," Pete said. He looked at Evelyn, then back at Colt, with the exact careful neutrality of a man who has decided not to say the thing he's thinking. "Pete, this is Evelyn Hart. She'll be managing the house. I need someone to help get her trunk inside and show her the storage room off the kitchen." Pete said, "Yes, sir," in the tone of a man storing several questions for a later time. Colt climbed down from the wagon and went around to the other side to offer Evelyn a hand down. She took it, not because she needed the help, but because refusing it would have been a different kind of statement. Her grip was firm, and she landed on the ground without any fuss. She looked at the house. He watched her look at it. It was not, he knew, an inviting sight. The porch needed boards replaced. The windows were streaked with dust. The front door had a long crack in the upper panel where the wood had dried and split, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, a house that had been well built and then somewhat given up on. "It needs work," he said. "Yes," she agreed, not unkindly, just honestly. "That's generally why I'm hoping you'll do it." She glanced at him sideways. "I thought the job was housekeeper, not miracle worker." "There might be some overlap," he said. And that, right there, was the first time Colt Mercer saw Evelyn Hart almost smile. The storage room off the kitchen was worse than he'd described it, which was saying something given how he'd described it. It was 8 feet by 10, crammed with broken equipment, 3 years of accumulated junk, a cot that listed to one side, and enough dust to fill a grain sack. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it without expression. Behind her, Pete Grady made a small sound that might have been an apology on behalf of the room. "I'll need this cleared," she said. "We can do that today," Pete said. "Couple of hours? We can get all this moved to the barn." She stepped inside carefully, testing the floorboards with her foot. They held. She crossed to the single small window and rubbed a circle in the dust with her sleeve, and thin gray October light came through. "There's a crack in the window frame," she said. "I can patch that too," Pete offered. She turned around and looked at him. Pete was a large man and slightly intimidating in the way that large men often are without meaning to be. But she met his eyes directly, and he was the first one to look away. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it." There was something in the way she said it. Not warm exactly, not yet, but precise, like someone measuring a distance and deciding whether to cross it. Pete nodded and went to find someone to help him move the junk. Evelyn turned back to the window. Outside, she could see the corner of the corral and beyond it, the mountains, dark and close and enormous. The kind of mountains that you understand intellectually from a distance and that you don't really understand at all until you're standing underneath them looking up. She pressed her fingertip to the cold glass. She had grown up with flat Ohio farmland in every direction and a sky that went on so long it felt lonely. These mountains were different, crowding and immense and permanent. She wasn't sure yet whether they felt like a trap or a shelter. She suspected she wouldn't know for a while. The first dinner she cooked at the Mercer Ranch was nothing remarkable. She'd found flour and lard and dried beans and salt pork in the kitchen stores, and she made biscuits and a thick bean soup, simple and filling. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to figure out what she had to work with. What she had to work with was a kitchen that was functional but disorganized in the specific way of a space where several different people have cooked badly for an extended period of time. Pans in the wrong places, spices jumbled together with no logic, a cast iron skillet that hadn't been properly seasoned in probably 6 months and showed it. She reorganized while the soup cooked. She wasn't going to comment on it to anyone. It just needed doing. The ranch hands came in for supper in 2 groups, the first 4 sitting down at the long table in the kitchen, the second group coming in from the barn about 20 minutes later. They were men between 20 and 40, worn and practical, and they sat down and looked at the food on the table with the mild suspicion of people who have been disappointed by meals before. Then they started eating. The soup disappeared faster than she'd expected. The biscuits were gone within 10 minutes. One of the younger hands, a boy, really, probably 19, with a gap between his front teeth, ate 3 biscuits in sequence and then looked up at her where she was standing near the stove and said, "Ma'am, these might be the best biscuits I've had since my mother's." "Don't oversell it," she said. "They're plain biscuits." "Yes, ma'am," he said cheerfully and reached for a 4th. Colt came in last, after the hands had mostly cleared out. He sat at the end of the table in the seat that was clearly his, worn in a specific way, set slightly apart from the others. And Evelyn put a bowl of soup in front of him and a plate of biscuits and went back to the stove. She heard the spoon moving. A pause. "This is good," he said. She didn't turn around. "It's just soup. My last cook's soup tasted like dishwater." "Your last cook was using the wrong ratio of salt pork to beans," she said. "I could tell from what was left in the pantry. You use too little pork and too much water, and you end up with something gray and sad." A silence. "Have you cooked professionally before?" he asked. "No, my mother taught me before she died. Then I cooked for my father and brothers for 8 years. She paused. "I'm fairly efficient at feeding people who don't appreciate it." Another silence. "I appreciate it," he said. She turned around. He was looking at his bowl, not at her, and he said it like he meant it, which somehow made it harder to receive than if he'd been looking right at her. "Thank you," she said. He finished the soup. He ate 2 biscuits. He pushed the chair back and stood, and he was almost at the door when he stopped. "The room," he said. "Is it manageable? She had spent 2 hours in the room after Pete, and another hand had cleared it out, scrubbing the floor and walls, patching the window crack with strips of cloth until a proper fix could be made, arranging her few possessions on the small shelf above the cot. It was 10 feet by 8, and it smelled like old wood and cold air. It was the first private room she'd had in 6 months. "It's fine," she said. He nodded and went out. She turned back to the stove and started cleaning the soup pot, and she didn't let herself think too much about the fact that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from something harder to name, the fragile, dangerous sensation of a situation that might, possibly, be something other than a disaster. She'd learned not to trust that feeling, but she hadn't quite learned to stop having it. Word got back to Silver Creek within 48 hours. She never found out exactly who told whom first. Probably Walt Henderson, who had the best intentions and the loosest lips of any man in the territory. But within 2 days of Evelyn Hart arriving at the Mercer Ranch, the fact of it was settled knowledge in town, and opinions formed the way opinions do in small communities, quickly, firmly, and without much need for facts. Dorothy Haynes, who ran the church auxiliary and whose opinion was treated as something between a verdict and a weather forecast, had the clearest view. "It's not appropriate," she told the 4 women gathered in her parlor on a Thursday afternoon. A single woman, living in a single man's home, with that woman's history. Colt Mercer should have known better. He might have been desperate, someone offered. His cook left back in August. There are respectable women in this town who could have helped him. He didn't need to go digging in the... Dorothy paused, editing herself. He made a choice that reflects poorly on his judgment. "Do you think something improper is..." "I think where there's smoke, there's fire," Dorothy said. "And that woman has been trailing smoke since she arrived." What Dorothy did not know, what nobody in her parlor knew, was that the practical reality of the Mercer Ranch was considerably less dramatic than the version being constructed in her parlor. The main house had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, and a separate room off the kitchen where Evelyn slept, with a door that latched from the inside. Colt Mercer spent his days working his land and his evenings reading or going over the ranch accounts at his desk, and he and Evelyn occupied the same house the way 2 people occupy the same town, in proximity, with occasional interaction, without particular intimacy. He was not a man who talked much. She was a woman who had learned not to expect conversation. They developed a kind of working rhythm that didn't require words most of the time. She managed the house, he managed the ranch, they ate meals in a silence that was not unfriendly, and gradually, by increments too small to point to, the house started to become something other than what it had been. It was Colt's foreman, a weathered 50-year-old named Hank Delaney, who finally addressed the situation directly. Hank had been with Colt for 7 years and had the seniority and the relationship to say things other people didn't. He came in from the range on the 8th day of Evelyn's employment, hung up his coat, sat down at the kitchen table for his midday meal, and looked at the food in front of him for a long moment before he looked up. Evelyn was at the counter, her back to him. "That's actual roast beef," Hank said. "Yes." "With gravy." "Yes." "And those are..." He squinted. "Are those proper carrots?" "I found them in the root cellar," she said. "Someone stored them well. They're still good." Hank looked at the food. He looked at the cleaner than it had been in years kitchen. He looked at the curtains that someone had apparently washed because they were no longer gray. "Miss Hart," he said. She turned around. Hank was a plain-spoken man, and she could see him working through something. His jaw moved like he was chewing on words before he let them out. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "Please. When the boss brought you out here, some of the boys had thoughts. Nothing they said out loud to him because nobody's that stupid, but there were thoughts." He picked up his fork, turned it in his fingers. "I've seen what happens when you bring when the situation isn't..." He stopped, started over. "I've seen other ranches, other arrangements. Sometimes they end badly." Evelyn waited. "But I've also been watching you for 8 days, he said. "You work harder than 2 men I can think of. You haven't complained once. You fixed that hinge on the back door that's been broken for 18 months without being asked, and you made roast beef on a Wednesday." He looked up at her. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "that the boys have settled. Whatever they thought at the start, they've settled." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the dish towel from the counter and turned back to the sink. "Thank you, Mr. Delaney," she said. "That matters more than you know." He ate his roast beef. He ate it slowly, because it was good, and because some things deserve to be appreciated properly. The letter from Colt's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Gerald Pruitt, arrived at the end of the second week. Pruitt was older than Colt, a prosperous man with strong opinions and a deep conviction that the prosperity of the community depended on maintaining certain standards. He and Colt had a civil relationship. They helped each other during branding season. They were polite at the same events, but they'd never been close. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph expressed concern, neighbor to neighbor, about the talk circulating through Silver Creek regarding Colt's recent hiring decision. It cited the need to maintain the reputation of the ranching community. It was careful and civilized and made its point without ever saying anything that could be called directly offensive. The second paragraph suggested, gently, that it might be in everyone's interest if Colt reconsidered the arrangement. Colt read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in his desk drawer. He went to the kitchen, where Evelyn was baking bread. The second loaf this week, because the first one had disappeared among the hands in under 20 minutes, and she'd decided the problem was supply, not demand. She looked up when he came in. "Pruitt wrote me a letter," he said. She straightened. Her hands were dusty with flour. Something moved across her face, a kind of bracing, a pulling inward. "What kind of letter?" she asked, very carefully. "The kind where a man says something unpleasant while working very hard to sound reasonable about it." She nodded slowly. Her eyes were steady, but her jaw was tight. "If you need me to—" "I'm going to write him back," Colt said. "What are you going to say?" He thought about it. "I'm going to say," he said slowly, "that I appreciate his concern, and that my hiring decisions are my own business, and that if he has further thoughts on the matter, he's welcome to come out and tell me in person." Evelyn looked at him. "He won't come in person." "No," Colt agreed. "He won't." She turned back to her bread dough and pressed into it with her palms. There was a long silence filled only with the sound of work. "Mr. Mercer," she said without looking up. "Colt," he said. "You live in my house. You can call me Colt." Another pause. "Colt," she said. The name sat in her mouth like something she wasn't sure she had the right to. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply, and went back to his desk. Evelyn pressed her hands into the dough. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall, a few preliminary flakes drifting past the kitchen windows like small, white, deliberate things, testing the air before the rest came down. She watched them for a moment. Then she went back to her bread. Shut. The days turned into weeks in the way that hard-working days do. Not gradually, but suddenly, so that one morning you look up and realize that 6 weeks have passed, and the rhythm of the place has rearranged itself around you without anyone deciding it would. By mid-November, several things were true. The kitchen was transformed. Not elegant. Evelyn wasn't working with elegant materials, but organized and functional and clean in a way it hadn't been in years, with herbs drying from the ceiling beams and the cast iron properly seasoned and a system for the pantry that anyone could follow. The main room had been quietly improved. The curtains washed and rehung, the floor scrubbed. A crack in the plaster near the fireplace patched with a competence that surprised Colt when he noticed it. The ranch hands had, to a man, become something close to devoted, not to her personally, not yet, but to the fact of what she represented, which was regular hot meals and a house that didn't smell like neglect anymore. Young Tommy Briggs, the gap-toothed boy, had taken to asking her cooking questions the way an apprentice asks a craftsman, with a seriousness that she found amusing and answered honestly. And Colt had started staying at the kitchen table a little longer after supper. It wasn't something he'd decided. It happened the way habits form, incrementally, without announcement. He'd finish eating, and instead of immediately going to his desk, he'd sit for a few minutes with his coffee, and she'd be cleaning up or preparing things for the next day. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. When they talked, it was practical at first. Ranch business. Whether the root cellar needed more laid in before the hard freeze, whether the crack in the barn roof was going to be a problem. Then it wasn't always practical. "You read a lot," she said one evening, nodding toward the book he'd brought to the table. "When I can." "What is that one?" He held up the spine. "Cooper, the Last of the Mohicans." I've read that, she said. My father had it. What did you think? She considered. I thought it was romantic in the way that things are romantic when they're about places you've never been and people you'll never know. She dried a pan. More honest than most adventure stories, though. Things don't go well for everyone. That bothered you? No, she said. I appreciated it. I'm suspicious of stories where everything works out. He looked at her over the book. Are you? He said. Aren't you? She said back without looking up from the pan. He thought about it. I used to believe things worked out, he said. Not anymore. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountains. But you're still here, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Still here, he agreed. She put the pan on its hook and reached for the next one. Then maybe that's enough, she said quietly. For now. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. He sat with his book and his cooling coffee, and outside the snow came down soft and heavy on 4,000 acres of land, and in the kitchen behind him, something that had been absent from the Mercer Ranch for 4 long years was trying, tentatively, the way things do in winter, quietly, without any guarantee, to begin. Snow came to the mountains differently than it came anywhere else Evelyn had ever lived. In Ohio, it arrived apologetically, soft and gray, settling into the flat earth like it wasn't sure it was wanted. Here in Colorado territory, it came with intention, heavy, deliberate, absolute. And in the 3rd week of November, it came all at once, dropping 18 inches in 2 days and sealing the Mercer Ranch inside a silence so complete it had a sound of its own. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window the morning after the first real storm and looked out at a world that had been remade overnight. The corral fence was buried to its second rail. The mountains had disappeared behind a wall of white. The path between the house and the bunkhouse was a trench that Hank and Pete had already carved out before sunrise, their tracks the only evidence that the world still had people in it. She put water on for coffee and started on breakfast. This was the rhythm she had built for herself over 6 weeks. Before anyone else was up, before the house made demands, she had 20 minutes that were just hers. Coffee heating. The particular dark quiet of a kitchen before work began. She'd learned to value those 20 minutes in a way she hadn't expected. They were the 20 minutes when she didn't have to be careful about anything. She was cracking eggs into the iron skillet when she heard Colt's boots on the stairs. He came in looking like a man who'd slept badly, which was, she'd come to realize, not unusual. He had the face of someone who woke up fighting something and never quite won. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, registered the coffee, and moved toward it with the single-mindedness of a man who needs to hold something hot. "Storm's done," he said. "I can see that. Hank thinks we need to push out to the north pasture today. Check on the cattle wintering up there. If any of them drifted into the timber last night, we need to move them back before the next system comes through." "When's the next system?" He looked at the sky through the window, the kind of look that men who work outside develop, a constant, unconscious calculation of weather. 2 days, maybe 3. She set a plate in front of him without being asked. Eggs, a slice of bread she'd made the day before, salt pork from the pan. He sat down and ate without ceremony. She'd noticed early that he didn't make a production of meals, didn't comment much, didn't compliment routinely. He ate, but he always finished everything on the plate, and she'd learned to take that as the review it was. "How many men are you taking?" she asked. "All of them. If the cattle drifted, it's going to take most of the day to push them back down." "I'll have food ready when you come back in." She paused. "The flour situation is getting tight, and we're low on salt pork." He looked up. "How low?" "Enough for a week, maybe 10 days if I stretch it." He was quiet for a moment, calculating. "Road into town might be passable by Thursday if it doesn't snow again." "I can make do until Thursday." He looked at her across the table. There was something in his expression she hadn't been able to name yet. She'd been cataloging his expressions over 6 weeks the way you learn a landscape gradually, by paying attention. This one was something between assessment and something else she hadn't identified. "I know you can," he said. It was a simple thing to say. She turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see that it had landed in a way she hadn't expected. The men left at first light, 7 of them in a group moving north through the snow, their horses' breath rising in white columns. Evelyn watched them go from the porch and then went inside to start the day. Alone in the house, she worked in a way she couldn't quite manage when the hands were around. faster, more absorbed, moving through tasks with a totality of focus that she found genuinely satisfying. She baked bread. She sorted and reorganized the remaining pantry stores, making an inventory in her head, calculating what could be stretched and how. She repaired a loose window latch in the sitting room that had been rattling every time the wind gusted, using a screwdriver she'd found in the mudroom and a skill she'd picked up watching her father fix things without ever asking for help. She was sewing a split seam on one of the curtains when she found the photograph. It was on the mantel, between a clock that worked and a small clay pot that probably served no purpose. She dusted around it dozens of times without looking at it directly. She'd understood instinctively that there were things in this house she wasn't meant to examine. But the curtain repair had brought her close to the mantel, and when she straightened, it was right there. A woman, younger than Evelyn was now, with dark hair and an expression that was attempting seriousness for the camera, but losing the battle with a smile. She was beautiful in an open, uncomplicated way. She looked like someone who laughed easily. Evelyn looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she straightened the curtain and went back to the kitchen. She didn't mention it to anyone. But that night, when Colt came in from the north pasture, exhausted and half frozen with ice in his mustache and mud on everything, and he sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world, she looked at him and understood something she hadn't before. He didn't keep the ranch going because he loved it. He kept it going because it was the only thing between him and nothing. She understood that in a way that settled in her chest and didn't leave. The men had found the cattle, 43 head that had pushed into the timber during the night, bunched together in the way cattle do when they're scared and cold. It had taken most of the day to get them moving, and 2 of the younger hands had nearly gotten turned around in the snow and timber before Hank found them. Nobody was hurt, but Colt came in with the particular tight quietness of a man who'd spent a day managing near disasters and was still running the calculations on what might have gone differently. "We lost 2, he said, not looking at her, staring at the table. "Found them in the creek. Went through the ice, probably last night." "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens." He said it with the resigned flatness of someone who has said a thing enough times that it has stopped being a comfort and is just a fact. It always happens in the first bad storm. You lose a few and the rest learn to stay out of the timber. Tommy Briggs, sitting at the far end of the table, was still too young to have the flatness. He was staring at his plate with something painful in his face. "You all right, Tommy?" Evelyn asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said too quickly. "Just—" He stopped. "One of them was the heifer I helped deliver back in March. I know you're not supposed to get attached to cattle." "Says who?" she asked. He looked up. "Someone decided that rule," she said, setting a bowl in front of him, "and I've never heard a good reason for it." Tommy stared at his bowl for a moment. Then he picked up his spoon. "Thank you, Miss Evelyn." Colt was watching her from the end of the table. When she glanced at him, he looked away, but not fast enough. The weeks that followed moved in the alternating rhythm of frontier winter. 2 or 3 calm days where the work was manageable and almost peaceful, then a storm that reordered everything, then the digging out afterward, then brief calm again. Evelyn adapted to the rhythm the way she adapted to most things, by adjusting her plans constantly and not making the adjustment into a tragedy. She had bigger meals on calm days when the men could eat properly, simpler things on storm days when everyone was cold and in a hurry. She learned which of the hands had particular preferences. Hank liked his coffee so strong it was practically solid. Pete would eat anything but had a particular horror of beets that she'd discovered accidentally and noted for future reference. Young Tommy would eat 3 helpings of anything and feel guilty about the 3rd. And she learned Colt, not intentionally, not the way a person learns someone when they're paying concentrated attention. She learned him the way you learn weather, by being in proximity to it long enough that you start to read the signs without thinking. She learned that he got up earlier than everyone else but came down to the kitchen later, which meant he went somewhere first. She eventually realized it was to the small rise at the north edge of the yard where you could see the mountains. She learned that he was harder on himself than on anyone else, and showed it by going quieter when something went wrong rather than louder. She learned that he read in the evenings because it was the only thing that put him fully in a different place, that the book mattered less than the transportation. And she learned that he'd stopped going to his wife's photograph. She wasn't sure when she noticed, but she was certain of it by December, that where he'd previously paused at the mantel sometimes when he passed through the sitting room, he no longer did. She didn't know what that meant, and she didn't ask. She filed it the way she filed most things, carefully, without conclusion. The social situation in Silver Creek did not improve. Dorothy Haynes sent 2 letters, not to Evelyn, who wasn't worth addressing directly in Dorothy's estimation, but to Colt, both phrased as concerned community correspondence. Colt showed Evelyn the second one without explanation, which told her more than not showing her would have. The arrangement is creating talk that reflects poorly on the entire community, it read. I write not from personal animosity, but from a genuine concern for the moral fabric of Silver Creek. There are proper channels through which domestic arrangements can be made without causing offense. She means a married woman, Evelyn said. I know what she means, Colt said. Are you going to answer it? He took the letter back. I'm going to put it with the first one. He put it in his desk drawer, the same drawer where Pruitt's letter lived, and shut it. But 2 days later, in town for supplies, the road had finally cleared enough. Evelyn felt the weight of Dorothy Haynes' opinion in every interaction. The woman at the general store who served her without meeting her eyes. The 2 women on the boardwalk who stopped their conversation and restarted it in lower voices when Evelyn passed. The way Walt Henderson was friendly but careful, watching the door while he talked to her like he was calculating who might walk in. She loaded the wagon herself and drove back to the ranch and didn't tell Colt any of it. There was no point. He already knew. And the telling would have required her to show more of what it cost her than she was willing to show. What she hadn't anticipated, couldn't have anticipated, was where the real opposition would come from. 3 days before Christmas, Douglas Crane rode out to the Mercer Ranch. She was hanging laundry in the mudroom when she heard the horse. She looked through the small mudroom window and felt her body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked the same. That was the first thing. She'd half expected him to look diminished somehow, worn down by guilt or consequences. The way villains in stories get worn by what they've done. But Crane was exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed for the territory, with the easy confidence of a man who has never had to apologize for anything real. He was talking to Hank by the barn. Hank's posture had a specific quality, polite and completely closed, the body language of a man who's decided he doesn't like the person he's talking to. Evelyn stood in the mudroom and did not go out. 2 minutes later, Colt came through the back door. He stopped when he saw her face. You saw him, he said. What does he want? Colt's jaw was tight. Says he wants to talk to you. I told Hank to tell him you weren't available. She exhaled slowly. He says he has something to tell you about... Colt paused. He says he has information about your family. Her stomach dropped. The last letter she'd written her brothers had been in October, before she'd left the church room at Silver Creek. No answer. She'd stopped expecting one. But the absence of an answer and someone walking onto the ranch claiming to have information about her family were 2 different things entirely, and they hit differently. I'll talk to him, she said. Evelyn, I'll talk to him. She untied her apron and set it on the hook. In the yard, not inside. Colt looked at her for a long moment. I'll be right there. I'll be right there, he said again, and something in his voice wasn't negotiable. They went out together. Crane was waiting near the fence with the comfortable ease of a man who expects to be accommodated. When he saw Evelyn, he arranged his face into something that was probably meant to look remorseful and landed closer to calculated. Evelyn, he said, you look well. She said nothing. I heard you found a situation out here. He glanced at Colt at the ranch house behind him, and there was something evaluative in it that made Colt take a very slight step forward. I'm glad. You said you had information about my family, Evelyn said. Her voice was flat and even. She'd had 100 yards of yard to prepare it. What information? Crane reached into his coat and produced a folded letter. He held it out to her. Came through the post for you, originally to the church. Reverend Thomas thought I might know where to find you. She took the letter. She recognized the handwriting on the outside, her brother James, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure made a small structural sound, like a board flexing under weight. She pressed it flat. Is that all? She said. Evelyn. His voice shifted, lower, the tone he'd used in Ohio when he wanted something. I wanted you to know that the situation with Margaret, my wife, it's complicated. It's not what you think. If you'd let me explain... No, she said. If you'd just listen. No, she said again, and there was nothing angry in it, which was somehow worse than anger. It was the no of someone who has finished a conversation that the other person doesn't know is over. Thank you for bringing the letter. She turned and walked back into the house. Colt watched her go. Then he turned to Crane. What he said was quiet, and he only said it once, and Crane didn't argue with any of it. 2 minutes later, Crane was back on his horse and riding toward the main road, and Colt stood in the yard in the December cold and watched him until he was out of sight. When he came in, Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, unopened. He sat down across from her. She looked at the envelope for another moment. Then she broke the seal. He didn't watch her read it. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the coffee cup she'd left near the stove. He listened to the particular quality of her silence as she read and heard when it changed. A very small sound, barely anything, a breath caught and controlled. My father is ill, she said. He looked at her. James says, she pressed her lips together for a moment. He says it's his heart. He says the doctor doesn't think he'll see spring. She folded the letter carefully along the original creases, as if that precision mattered right now. He didn't ask me to come home. James, I mean. He thought I should know. Do you want to go? Colt asked. She looked up at him. Ohio is a 3-day journey, minimum. The roads in winter and the ranch. I'm asking what you want, he said. Not what's practical. She looked at the folded letter on the table. I don't know that I'd be welcome, she said. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a person actively managing something that wanted to be otherwise. James told me not to come back. Both of them did. My father didn't write. He might be too ill to write. He might not want to. She straightened in her chair. He might have made his position clear months ago, and nothing that's happened since has changed it. She picked up the letter and set it down again. I don't know, and not knowing it's a particular kind of thing. Colt was quiet. He was not a man who filled silence with words just to fill it, which was most of the time a quality she valued and right now made the silence feel very large. I have a sister-in-law I've never met, she said. James married while I was still believing I was going to marry Crane. I didn't find out until everything fell apart. She almost laughed, but it didn't quite make it to her face. I've never met her, and apparently she's the one who thought to write. Colt reached across the table and picked up her coffee cup. Hers, not his, and got up and refilled it at the stove. He set it back in front of her. It was such a small thing. She stared at the cup. Thank you, she said. He sat back down. Outside, the light was doing what December light does in Colorado, failing too early, the sky going from pale to gray to dark in the space of an hour, the mountains already swallowed by it. The kitchen lamp made a warm circle that reached about as far as the table. My wife's mother, Colt said. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, the same way she had been. After Sarah died, her mother sent one letter, said she hoped I was coping, never wrote again. He was quiet for a moment. I think it was too hard for her. Looking at me, even in letters, meant thinking about Sarah. And she didn't. He stopped. I stopped expecting it eventually. Evelyn didn't say anything. Doesn't mean it stopped mattering, he said. She looked at her coffee. They sat in the kitchen while the dark came down outside and the lamp burned, and somewhere in the bunkhouse one of the hands was playing a mouth harp badly and distantly, a sound that was simultaneously terrible and comforting in the way of most imperfect human things. The blizzard that hit the third week of December was different from the November storm in the way a fire is different from the warning smell of smoke. The November storm had been heavy and disruptive. This one had a quality of intent. 3 days straight, wind that drove snow sideways at speeds that could take your direction from you in 20 feet. Temperatures that dropped to places where iron tools burned bare skin and water froze in pails inside the barn. The second day of it, Colt went out at midnight to check on the cattle in the south pasture and didn't come back. Evelyn didn't know he was gone until 6 in the morning when she came down to start the kitchen fire and found the hook by the door where his coat should have been empty and his boots gone, and Hank standing in the yard with a lantern looking at the wall of white beyond the fence with an expression that she'd never seen on Hank's face before and hoped never to see again. How long, she said. He went out around midnight. Should have been back in 2 hours. 6 hours, she said. Yes. Why didn't anyone... I thought he came back in the north door. Pete thought the same. Hank's voice was rough with something that wasn't quite guilt, but was close to it. We should have checked earlier. There was no point in saying that. Get the men up, she said. All of them. Rope lines between the buildings. We're not losing anyone else out there. He looked at her. Just a fraction of a second of surprise, then he went. She got back inside and built up the fire and put every kettle and pot she had on to heat. And she pulled every blanket from the linen closet and stacked them by the stove. And she told herself that if she just kept her hands moving, she would be all right. And she mostly believed it. They found him 2 hours later. He'd made it to the south pasture. The cattle were there, wind-huddled and miserable, but alive. And on the way back, the storm had gotten worse and he'd gone down in a drift up to his chest. He'd had the presence of mind to get under the snow, which had saved him from the worst of the wind exposure. But by the time Pete and Tommy reached him on the rope line, he'd been down there for at least 4 hours, and he couldn't feel his feet, and only barely his hands, and he wasn't making complete sense when he talked. They half carried him in. Evelyn met them at the door. She looked at his face, gray-white, the lips wrong-colored, his eyes not quite tracking right, and she did not let herself feel anything except the next necessary thing. Table, she said. Get his coat and boots off. Don't rub the feet, don't do it. Just get the wet things off him. Tommy, get those blankets from by the stove. Pete said, Miss Evelyn, maybe we should... Now, she said, not unkindly, just completely. They moved. What followed was the longest 6 hours of Evelyn Hart's life in the Colorado Territory. She'd had some experience with cold injuries, by growing up in Ohio with brothers who regularly did stupid things outdoors, but nothing like this. Nothing this serious. She worked from memory and instinct, warming him gradually the way you're supposed to, wrapping his feet in the blankets she'd heated, watching the color come back, or not come back, and watching his face for the specific signs of a man coming back from the edge of something bad. He was mostly incoherent for the first 2 hours. He said things that didn't connect. He said Sarah's name twice, in a voice that had no defenses in it, the voice of a man who wasn't controlling what he said because he didn't have the capacity to. Evelyn kept working. Hank stood near the kitchen door for most of those hours. Pete came and went. Tommy came back twice, pretending to need things from the kitchen, but actually just needing to see that Colt was still breathing, which Evelyn understood. Around midday, Colt's color was almost normal, and he'd stopped saying things that didn't make sense and had graduated to saying nothing at all, which was a significant improvement. He was propped up on the narrow bench near the stove with every spare blanket on the ranch piled over him and both hands wrapped and elevated, and his feet in a basin of water that Evelyn kept adjusting in temperature. He looked at her. "My boots," he said. "Ruined," she said. "We'll get you new ones." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his wrapped hands. "How bad?" "You'll keep everything," she said. "I think. You got under the snow when you should have, and the cattle drift broke some of the wind. You were very lucky." She said lucky in a specific way that conveyed how close the other thing had been. He let out a long, slow breath. "The cattle," he started. "The cattle are fine," Hank said from the doorway. Colt looked at him. "You found them?" "They found themselves. They're not as stupid as they look." Something moved across Colt's face that might have been the start of a smile. It didn't quite make it. "I'll fire you for that." "Yes, sir," Hank said, and went back to the main room. Evelyn was checking the water temperature in the basin when Colt said quietly, "Thank you." She didn't look up. It needed doing. A pause. "That's what I said to you," he said, "the day I hired you." She looked up then. His eyes were serious, gray, the color of the sky outside. There was nothing calculating in his face right now. The cold and the exhaustion had stripped that away, left something simpler and more direct. "I know," she said. She went back to the basin. Her hands were completely steady, which she considered privately a significant personal achievement. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, leaving a white silence that extended to every horizon and a cold that was brutal but static, without the wind's malice. The ranch emerged slowly from under it. The men dug out, checked the herd, assessed the damage, fixed what could be fixed. Colt was on his feet by day 5, moving carefully, his hands still wrapped in lighter bandages and his feet tender but functional. He moved around the ranch at a reduced pace that he didn't comment on and that everyone else pretended not to notice. He came into the kitchen on the 6th evening carrying the small photograph from the mantel. Evelyn was at the stove with her back to him. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. "I've been thinking," he said. She turned. He was holding the photograph at his side, not looking at it, looking at her. "That night, when they brought me in. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He set the photograph down on the table gently, face up. Sarah's laughing face looked up at the kitchen ceiling. "I said her name." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I know I did." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I—" He stopped, looked at the photograph. "I'm not done grieving her. I don't know that I ever will be. That's not something that ends." She didn't say anything. "But there's a difference," he said slowly, working through it like a man who doesn't speak the interior of himself very often, and is doing it anyway, with effort, between grief that's everything and grief that's part of things. I think somewhere in the last 2 months it shifted, and I don't know exactly what that means, but I thought you should know it happened. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire ticked. Outside, the white world held still. Evelyn looked at him across the kitchen, this man who'd given her a room and a job and a defense she hadn't asked for, who'd gone through a blizzard for his cattle and set his dead wife's name in the cold, who was standing in her kitchen telling her the truth without asking for anything in return. "I know it happened," she said quietly. "I noticed." He looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be honest, short enough to be careful, and then she turned back to the stove. She heard him pull out the kitchen chair, the sound of him sitting down, the small sounds of a man who's decided, for now, to stay where it's warm. She cooked, and he sat, and outside the stars came out one by one over 4,000 acres of snow, and neither of them said anything else, and somehow that was enough. The days between Christmas and the New Year had a specific quality in the territory, a held-breath stillness, like the land itself was taking stock. The worst of the December blizzard had passed, but the cold remained, deep and permanent, the kind that settled into the bones of buildings and the joints of men who'd worked outside too long. Colt's hands had healed enough that he'd stopped wearing the bandages, though the skin on his right palm was still tender, and he'd sometimes stop in the middle of a task and press it flat against his thigh without appearing to notice he was doing it. Evelyn noticed. She noticed most things about the house now. The way the second step from the bottom creaked differently depending on the temperature, the way the wind came through the north-facing window in the sitting room at a particular angle that made the lamp flame lean. She noticed that Hank drank his 3rd coffee of the morning standing up, always, like sitting down for it would mean the workday hadn't started yet. She noticed that Tommy Briggs had started keeping a small journal, writing in it after supper with the self-conscious intensity of a young man who has recently discovered that writing things down makes them more real. And she noticed that Colt had moved Sarah's photograph. Not removed it, just moved it, from the mantel in the main sitting room to the small shelf in the upstairs hallway, outside his bedroom door. She'd seen it when she went up to change the window dressing in the spare room. She hadn't said anything. She filed it the same way she filed most things about him, carefully, without attaching more meaning to it than the fact itself warranted, which was difficult, if she was being honest with herself. And she was trying to be honest with herself because the alternative was the kind of comfortable self-deception that she'd already paid for once and couldn't afford again. The letter from her brother James sat in the drawer of her small nightstand. She'd read it 4 times. Her father was ill. Her father had not written. James had relayed the information with the clipped efficiency of a man who considers emotion a kind of personal weakness, and had added at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, "Margaret thinks you should know. I'll leave it at that." Margaret, the sister-in-law she'd never met, the one who thought she should know. Evelyn had written back, a short letter, careful and controlled, asking about her father's condition and whether there was anything she could do from a distance, which they both understood meant she wasn't coming home because there was no home to come to. Not really. Not anymore. She had not heard back. She mailed the letter from Silver Creek on the one afternoon she'd gone to town since the storm, and she'd gone early and returned quickly, and she'd done it on a Thursday because Dorothy Haynes ran her auxiliary meetings on Thursday mornings and was reliably absent from the parts of town Evelyn would need to be in. She wasn't hiding, she was managing. There was a difference, though sometimes she had to remind herself what it was. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with a thin new snow that wasn't a storm, but was enough to make the world look deliberately arranged, the kind of snow that falls in small, perfect flakes because it has nowhere to be. Evelyn had spent 2 days preparing for it in the way she prepared for most things, practically, without sentimentality, which is different from without feeling. She'd made a proper Christmas dinner out of what the pantry offered, a goose that Pete had procured from somewhere he was vague about, roasted with dried herbs and the last of the apple preserves. Sweet potatoes, biscuits, a dried fruit cake that had been soaking in a little bourbon for 3 days because her mother used to make it that way. And the smell of it, when she lifted the cloth each morning to check it, was the closest thing to Ohio she'd felt since she left. The hands ate in 2 sittings and were louder than usual in the good way. Stories, arguments about nothing important, Tommy's terrible and enthusiastic mouth harp. And when they cleared out to the bunkhouse, Evelyn stood in the kitchen in the particular silence that follows a lot of noise and felt, briefly and unexpectedly, the edges of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something more tentative. The possibility of it, maybe. She was washing the last of the dishes when Colt came back in from the barn. He'd gone out after supper to check on the animals. He did this every night, but on the cold nights he stayed longer, making sure everyone was settled. He hung up his coat and stood near the stove, warming his hands and watching her work in the way he'd started doing lately without appearing to be aware of it. "The goose," he said. She waited. "It was the best meal I've had in—" He stopped, reconsidered. "It was very good." She handed him the last clean dish to dry. "The bourbon cake will be better. It needs another 2 days." He took the dish and dried it. They'd developed this unconscious division of labor over weeks. She washed, he dried the last few things. Neither of them had ever discussed it or decided it. It just was. "My mother used to make a cake like that," he said. "With bourbon? With whiskey. Same idea." He put the dish on the shelf. She'd make it in November and hide it from my father, who she claimed would eat it before it was ready. He claimed he didn't know where it was. Evelyn smiled at the dish she was drying. Did he? Of course he did. He just had enough sense to pretend otherwise. She handed him the last cup. He dried it. He didn't put it on the shelf right away. He stood with it in his hands, looking at it the way men sometimes look at small objects when they're thinking about something else entirely. "I have something for you," he said. She turned. He set the cup down on the counter and reached into his vest pocket and brought out something small. He set it on the counter between them. It was a key. Old iron, worn smooth, attached to a small piece of stamped leather with the letter M pressed into it. She looked at it, then at him. "It's the key to the lockbox in the study," he said, "where I keep the ranch accounts, the deed, important papers." He was looking at the key, not at her. "Hank has the other one, has for years, in case something happens to me." She didn't move. "I want you to have one," he said. "Colt, it's not—" He stopped, started over. "It's not a gesture. It's practical. You manage this house. You manage the stores, the supplies, the accounts for the household. If something happened, if I went down in another storm, if anything, you should be able to access what you need." "That's not the only reason," she said quietly. A long pause. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. Solid, real, the weight of something that meant what it said. She held it in her palm and looked at it and felt it land in a place that had been empty for a long time. "This is a significant thing to give someone," she said. "I know that." "The town will say—" "The town can say whatever it wants," he said, and there was nothing heated in it, just a simple finality, the tone of a man who has made a decision and is done with the making of it. "I stopped caring what the town says around the same time I stopped eating canned beans 4 nights a week." She looked up at him. There were maybe 5 feet between them in the kitchen, and the lamp on the table made the kind of light that is honest without being harsh, and she could see his face clearly, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years outdoors and years of loss, the set of his jaw that was not stubbornness exactly, but its more constructive cousin, the way he was looking at her with the careful directness of a man who has decided to stop pretending. She closed her fingers around the key. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He was not a man who knew what to do with the moments after significance, so he did what he usually did. He picked up his book from the table, said good night, and went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after his footsteps had crossed the floor above her. Then she put the key in her pocket and went to her room. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay on her cot in the room that had been a storage closet and was now the most private space she'd had in a year, with the key in her closed hand, and she thought about what honesty required of her. Because honesty required her to admit that she had feelings for Colt Mercer that were not the feelings of a housekeeper for an employer. Had them, probably, for longer than she wanted to acknowledge. And feelings like that on a situation like this one were complicated, were dangerous, were the exact thing that people like Dorothy Haynes had already decided she was guilty of before she'd done anything at all. And the most honest thing was this. She was not certain he was wrong to trust her with a key, but she was not certain she was equipped to be trusted with more than that. She'd been wrong before. Spectacularly, consequentially wrong. She'd believed Douglas Crane was a man who meant what he said, and that error had cost her everything she'd had. She did not trust her own judgment about men in the way she'd once trusted it. That was the thing nobody talked about when they talked about what Crane had done to her. Not the public embarrassment, not the loss of home, not the whispers in Silver Creek. The real damage was subtler than all of that. It was the specific, persistent uncertainty about whether her own perception of people could be relied upon. She pressed the key against her palm in the dark. Then she put it in the drawer of her nightstand next to James's letter and made herself sleep. The second letter arrived the day after Christmas. Not from her brother. From her father. The handwriting was not what she remembered. Shakier. The letters less certain of themselves. The hand of a man writing through pain or weakness or both. But it was his. She'd know it anywhere. She'd grown up watching it move across examination papers, across letters of recommendation for students he believed in, across the birthday cards he made himself every year because he thought the printed ones were impersonal. She read it standing at the kitchen counter because she'd been in the middle of something when Colt brought it in from the mailbag Pete had collected in town. She didn't stop to sit down. She read it standing up, and she was glad she was alone. Her father was not a sentimental man. The letter was short. He said he was ill and that he knew it. He said he understood she was somewhere in Colorado Territory, and that he hoped she had found something stable. He said, and here the handwriting wobbled slightly, or maybe that was her eyes, that he had not written sooner because he hadn't known what to say, and that was not an excuse, only an explanation, and he understood the difference. At the bottom he wrote, "You were not wrong to go. He deceived you. I should have said this sooner. I am sorry that I didn't." 8 words. I should have said this sooner. I am sorry. She folded the letter and pressed it flat on the counter with both palms, the way you press something to make sure it's real. She stood there for a minute, maybe 2. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and cried. Not the controlled, quiet kind of crying she'd done in her room in difficult moments, but the other kind, the inelegant kind, the kind that comes up from a place you didn't know still had that much in it. She was not quiet about it. Colt was in the study 20 feet away with the door mostly closed. She heard it open. She heard his footsteps cross the main room. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. He didn't say anything. She heard the chair across from her scrape on the floor. Him sitting down. Not reaching for her, not speaking, just being in the room, in the specific way that some people know how to be present without making demands of it. She cried for another minute. Then she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the table because she couldn't look at him yet. "My father wrote," she said. "I figured." She slid the letter across the table. He read it. She watched his face move through it. "He apologized," Colt said. "Yes." "Do you believe him?" She thought about it. "I think he means it. I think he's sick, and he's looking at things he wishes he'd done differently." She paused. "I think he should have said it 6 months ago. I think not saying it when it mattered was a choice, even if it didn't feel like one." She took the letter back. "And I think all of that can be true at the same time." Colt was quiet. "I used to think forgiveness was simple," she said. "That you either did it or you didn't. That it was a door you walked through and then it was done." She smoothed the letter's edges. "It turns out it's more like," she searched for it, More like weather. It changes. It comes back around. He was watching her with that careful attention she'd come to know. The look of a man who is listening in the full-body way, not just waiting for his turn to speak. "I'm going to write him back," she said. "Good. I don't know what I'm going to say." "You don't have to know yet." She finally looked up at him. His face in the December light was serious and quiet and completely without pity, which was exactly what she needed it to be. "I'm sorry," she said, "for—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at the situation, at the letter. "Don't," he said. She stopped. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "Not in this kitchen." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was shifting in the room. Had been shifting for days, maybe longer, the way ground shifts before a thaw, invisibly beneath the surface. She felt it, and she thought he felt it, and she thought they were both, for their own reasons, being careful about it. She picked up the letter and stood. "I'm going to write to him tonight," she said. He nodded. She was at the kitchen doorway when he said, "Evelyn." She turned. He was still sitting at the table, one hand flat on the wood, looking at her with something in his face that had come uncalculated, something that got past the control he generally maintained over his own expression. "He's right," Colt said. "You weren't wrong to come." She held on to the doorframe. "Neither was I," he said. "When I hired you, I wasn't wrong about that." She stood there for one more second. Then she went to her room to write her father a letter, and she did it with the small iron key in her pocket and the weight of it against her hip. And she wrote until the lamp burned low and the cold pressed in through the window crack she'd patched with cloth in November, and then patched again in December with better material. And she wrote her father the truth, that she was all right, that she had found something that might be stability, that she was glad he'd written, that she would write again. She did not write that she was afraid. She was. She was afraid in the specific way of someone who has started to want something and knows from experience that wanting things is where the damage tends to begin. She finished the letter, folded it, sealed it. She put it with the key in the drawer. She lay down on her cot and looked at the ceiling in the dark. It was 3 days to the new year. She did not know yet what the new year would ask of her. The situation that broke things open happened not with ceremony, but with the blunt randomness of most things that matter. 2 days after Christmas, Gerald Pruitt rode into town and had a long conversation with Dorothy Haynes at the church auxiliary meeting that Dorothy had rescheduled from Thursday to Saturday because of the holiday. What was said between them was never fully known. What resulted from it was a visit to the ranch, not Pruitt alone, but Pruitt and Reverend Thomas together, which gave the thing the texture of an official occasion. Evelyn saw them coming from the kitchen window. 2 riders side by side, coming down the main approach at the unhurried pace of men who are confident they have a right to be where they're going. She went to find Colt. He was in the barn with Hank, working on a harness repair. He listened to what she said without expression. Then he set the harness down and dusted his hands on his pants. "Go inside," he said. "I'd rather not." He looked at her. "I know. But right now, it would help me if you went inside." She understood what he meant, that her presence at the initial conversation would escalate it, would give Pruitt and Thomas exactly the dynamic they were looking for, 2 men explaining propriety to a man standing next to the woman in question. She didn't like it. She went inside. She stood near the mudroom window where she could hear without being seen. Pruitt did most of the talking. He was a man who had grown comfortable with the sound of his own voice in the way of men who are used to being listened to. He said what Dorothy Haynes had sent him to say, that the arrangement at the Mercer Ranch was a source of genuine concern in the community, that the woman's history made the situation particularly troubling, that Colt's reputation, which was good and ought to be protected, was suffering as a result of his choices, that there were proper ways to manage a household, and this was not one of them. Reverend Thomas said less, but nodded often, which was its own kind of participation. When Pruitt finished, there was a silence. Then Colt said, "Are you done?" Pruitt said he was. "All right," Colt said. "I'm going to say this once, plainly, because I think you're owed a plain answer. Miss Hart manages this house. She does it well. She is a woman who was deceived by a man who is still running a business in this town without anyone making formal visits to his property, which I notice. I hired her because she needed work, and I needed help, and that situation has not changed, and I don't intend to change it." A pause. Pruitt started to say something. "I'm not finished," Colt said, and there was a quality to it that stopped Pruitt completely. "I've lived in this territory for 10 years. I've paid my taxes. I've helped my neighbors in difficult seasons. I've built something here from nothing. I am telling you, respectfully, that what happens on this ranch is not a community matter. It's my matter." Reverend Thomas tried a gentler angle. "Colt, nobody is questioning your character. Only the wisdom of, with respect, Reverend, you're questioning both." A pause. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. Evelyn heard their horses leave. She heard Colt's boots cross the yard. She moved away from the window and went back to the stove. And when he came in through the back, she was stirring something that didn't particularly need stirring. He said nothing immediately. He poured himself a coffee. "I heard," she said. "I figured you might." She kept stirring. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "They'll go back to Dorothy Haynes and she'll—" "I know." She turned around. He was leaning against the counter, holding his coffee, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something resolved, something that had been through a reckoning and come out the other side. "Colt." She said his name carefully. "What are you doing?" He looked at his coffee, then at her. "I've been trying to figure that out," he said, "for about 6 weeks." The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the thin Christmas snow was still on the ground, undisturbed, white all the way to the fence line. "I'm not—" She stopped. "I need to be honest with you." "All right. I'm not certain my judgment is reliable," she said. "About people. About situations. I was wrong before in a way that cost me everything, and I don't know how much of what I think I understand about this—" She gestured between them, not quite able to make it a sentence. "I don't know how much of it is real and how much is gratitude, or proximity, or needing somewhere to be." It was the most honest thing she'd said to him since the day on the wagon when she'd told him she had nowhere to go back to. It cost the same amount. He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "I've thought about that too, whether it's grief doing the talking or loneliness." He set his coffee down. "I don't have a clean answer. Neither do I. But I don't think—" He stopped. Found it. "I don't think uncertainty means nothing. I think sometimes you know a thing is real because of how much it costs you to be careful about it." She looked at him across the kitchen. "That's what I've been doing," he said. "Being careful about it." She had nothing to say to that, because it was true for her as well, and they both knew it. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "Not tonight. I wanted you to know that what I said to Pruitt wasn't just about the ranch, or the house, or what I need from a housekeeper." Evelyn pressed her lips together. She looked at the floor, at his boots, at her own hands, anywhere that wasn't directly at his face, because his face right now was doing something that she didn't have defenses for, and she knew it. "Colt," she said. Her voice was lower than she intended. "I need you to understand something." He waited. "I have been—" She chose each word. "I have been careful about this too. Very careful. Because the last time I trusted what I thought I knew about a situation, I ended up sleeping in a church storage room and splitting firewood in an alley. I know that. I'm not saying that to make you feel— I'm saying it because you need to understand what you're dealing with. I am not someone who is going to be easy about this. I'm not someone who trusts easily anymore, or who won't second-guess things, or who isn't going to have days where I wonder if I'm making the same mistake twice." "I know that too," he said. "And you still—" "Yes," he said. "Simple. No ceremony." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved across the kitchen. The distance between them stayed exactly what it was, but something in it changed anyway. The quality of it, the texture, the weight. The distance between two people who are pretending there is no distance, and the distance between two people who have acknowledged it and are deciding carefully what to do about it. Those are different kinds of distance entirely. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "All right," he said. She turned back to the stove. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the night was clear and very cold, the stars dense and indifferent above the territory, above Silver Creek and Dorothy Haynes and Gerald Pruitt and the whole apparatus of other people's opinions. Inside the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch, The lamp burned warm, and a woman who had been thrown away by almost everyone she'd ever known stood at the stove. And a man who had spent 4 years disappearing into his own grief sat at the table, and between them something was being built, slowly, without any guarantee, in the way that real things are built. They married on New Year's Day. It was not a grand affair. There was no time to make it one, and neither of them was particularly interested in grand. What happened was this. Colt rode into Silver Creek on the morning of December 31st and came back 2 hours later with a marriage license and a look on his face that was not quite certainty and not quite fear, but something that lived between them, in the territory where real decisions are made. He found Evelyn in his kitchen. She was almost always in the kitchen when he needed to find her. And he set the license on the table in front of her without preamble. She looked at it, then at him. "You went to town," she said. "I did." "You got a license?" "I did." She pulled the paper toward her and read it. Her name, his name, the date, the county seal. It was real and legal and sitting on her kitchen table next to a bowl of bread dough she'd been working before he came in. "You didn't ask me," she said. "No." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I'm asking you now." She looked at the license. She looked at her flour-covered hands. She looked at him. "Colt." Her voice was careful. "3 days ago, we were standing in this kitchen, agreeing that we weren't certain about anything." "I know." "And now you have a marriage license." "I know that too." "What changed between 3 days ago and this morning?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who has thought something through alone and is now finding that the interior version and the spoken version are two different operations. "Pruitt came by again yesterday," he said, "while you were in the root cellar." She stilled. He wasn't threatening. He was... Colt's jaw moved. He was reasonable about it. That's almost worse. He said the situation needed to resolve itself one way or another. He said the community was watching. He said there were families in Silver Creek who were considering whether to do business with this ranch based on... He stopped. Based on the character of the people running it. Evelyn set the license down flat. "He's trying to put financial pressure on you." "Yes. And your answer to financial pressure was to get a marriage license." "My answer to financial pressure," Colt said, "was to realize I'd been waiting for the right moment to do something I already knew I wanted to do, and that waiting for the right moment is usually just fear with better manners." She looked at him across the table. "I'm not asking you to marry me because of Pruitt," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Pruitt is the reason I stopped waiting. He's not the reason I'm asking." The bread dough sat between them, slowly rising. "There's something I haven't told you," Evelyn said. His expression didn't change, but she felt him become more still. "It's not..." She stopped, started over. "It's not something bad. It's something I should have told you sooner and didn't, because I was afraid of how it would land." She looked at her hands. "When I came here, when Crane brought me out here, I wasn't entirely without information." He waited. "I knew about the wife," she said, "not before I left Ohio, but I found out 2 weeks after I arrived in the territory. Someone told me, a woman in town who knew the situation." She kept her eyes on her hands. "I had already left Ohio. I had told my family I was getting married. I had already written letters that I couldn't unsend." She paused. "And I stayed. For 3 more months, I stayed. I told myself I was waiting to see if it would work itself out, that maybe the situation in Missouri was over, that maybe he was going to handle it." She looked up. "I knew, and I stayed anyway, and when everything came out publicly, I let people believe I hadn't known, because the truth was worse. The truth was that I'd made a choice out of desperation and pride, and I'd let it go on too long." The kitchen was very quiet. "So when this town looks at me," she said, "and decides I'm not what I should be, they're not entirely wrong. Not about everything." Colt said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" he said. "Because you just put a marriage license on my table and you deserve to know who you're asking." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the weight of it. Not as judgment, but as genuine thinking, as a man taking something seriously. "You were 23 years old," he said, "alone in a new territory, with no money to go back and nowhere to go back to. That's not an excuse." "No," he said, "but it's a fact, and facts matter to me more than the story people tell about them." She looked at the license. I lied, she said. By omission, for 3 months, I lied. And I'm not good at carrying that. I need you to know I'm not good at it. I know you're not, he said. You just told me. She pressed her lips together. Evelyn. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the procedural quality it sometimes had. I buried my wife 4 years ago, and I spent every day after that going through the motions of a man who intends to keep living without actually doing it. I'm not looking for someone without a past. I'm looking for someone who tells me the truth about theirs. She picked up the license, read it again, put it down. The town will have things to say, she said. The town already has things to say. It'll be worse. Probably. I'm not easy to be married to. She said it flatly, not as self-deprecation, but as information. I have opinions. I don't manage my feelings quietly. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong. Good, he said. I've been the only person on this ranch willing to tell me when I'm wrong since Hank stopped trusting me to take it well. She almost smiled. Didn't quite make it. Ask me properly, she said. He looked at her. Then he did. He asked her plainly, without theater, in the specific direct way that was his natural language. Will you marry me? Not because the circumstances require it, not because Pruitt is maneuvering against the ranch, but because this kitchen has been more of a home in 2 months than this house has been in 4 years. And that's your doing, and I don't want it to stop. He didn't say all of it exactly that way. He said it in pieces, working through it, a man talking his way to the end of something he'd started without a map. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. Yes, she said. Not because the word felt easy, because it felt true. They were married the next morning in the study of the magistrate's office in Silver Creek, with Hank Delaney as witness on Colt's side and, unexpectedly, Margaret Delaney, no relation to Hank, on Evelyn's. Margaret was the young wife of the blacksmith 2 streets over, a cheerful and somewhat fearless woman who had appeared at the ranch the previous afternoon with a pie and the announcement that she'd heard what was happening and thought someone ought to stand up for it. Evelyn had stared at her for a full 5 seconds. I don't know you, Evelyn said. My name is Margaret Aldrin, the woman said. My husband is Tom Aldrin at the smithy, and I know who you are, and I know what this town has been saying, and I think it's been wrong. She held out the pie. Apple. Do you want a witness tomorrow or not? Evelyn took the pie. Yes, she said. Thank you. So there were 4 of them in the magistrate's office on New Year's Day, and outside the window Silver Creek went about its business in the cold, and the magistrate read the words that needed to be read, and Colt took Evelyn's hand and held it through the whole of it, which was not a long time but felt significant in the way of things that mark a before and after. When it was done, Hank shook Colt's hand with both of his and said, Took you long enough, which was as close as Hank got to emotional expression, and Colt said, Mind your business, which was as close as he got to gratitude. Margaret Aldrin embraced Evelyn on the steps of the magistrate's office in the cold January air. Evelyn was not naturally a person who accepted embraces from near strangers, but she returned this one. People will talk, Margaret said. They already are, Evelyn said. Well, Margaret said cheerfully, then we've got nothing to lose. She was, Evelyn thought, going to be a friend. The thought arrived quietly and settled without announcement, the way real things do. The ride back to the ranch was different from every other ride they'd taken on that road. The landscape was the same, bare winter trees, snow-covered fields, mountains in their permanent positions, but the silence between them had changed quality. It was the silence of 2 people who are figuring out what they've just done, not with regret. With the sober weight of people who have made a real decision and are beginning to understand its dimensions. Hank is going to tell the hands, Colt said. He's probably already told them, Evelyn said. Probably. A pause. They'll have thoughts. Tommy will be happy, she said. Pete will be relieved because it means I'm definitely staying and I'm the only one who can fix his coat properly. Hank was already glad. She paused. The others will follow Hank. He glanced at her sideways. You know my men better than I do. I feed them twice a day, she said. You learn things. He turned back to the road. Duke moved steadily through the cold. My name is different now, she said, mostly to herself. Does that feel strange? She thought about it honestly. Hart was my father's name, and it's been complicated between me and my father. She looked at her gloved hands in her lap. Mercer it's yours. It's yours now, too. I know? She looked at the mountains coming into view as they topped the last rise before the ranch. I think I'll need some time to inhabit it. A name you inherit is different from one you choose. Take whatever time you need, he said. They came down toward the ranch, and as they did, the bunkhouse door opened, and Tommy Briggs came out and stood on the step. And when he saw the wagon, he raised one arm in an awkward wave that was trying to be dignified and couldn't quite manage it. And that simple, graceless gesture was somehow more welcoming than anything ceremony could have offered. Evelyn raised her hand back. She was home. The blizzard came in the second week of January without much warning. The territory had ways of telling you the particular color of the afternoon sky, the behavior of the horses, the quality of the cold, but this one moved faster than the sign suggested, and by the time anyone on the Mercer Ranch understood what was coming, it was already there. It was worse than the December storm, worse than anything most of the hands had seen in the territory. The snow came horizontal, and the wind had a sound to it that was beyond weather, a sound like the land itself had decided to make a point. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the outdoor troughs froze in under an hour. Colt was in the barn when it hit. He stayed there, because going back to the house in the first hour of that storm would have meant losing the barn. He needed hands at the animals, keeping them calm, making sure nothing panicked and broke through the boards. He sent Tommy to the house with a message for Evelyn. Stay inside. Keep the fires going. Don't open the doors for anything. Tommy came back 20 minutes later, which was faster than Colt expected. She says she understands, Tommy said, shaking snow off everything. And she's sending food over when it's safe to move between the buildings, and she's already got the fires built up, and she wants to know the head count on everyone accounted for. Colt stared at him. She sent a head count request. Yes, sir. She wants to know everyone's location. He looked around the barn. 8 men, including himself. Tell her 8 in the barn. Tell her we're all here. Tommy went back. He came back again 20 minutes after that with a covered pot of something that steamed when he uncovered it, and a message that said, Eat this. All of you. I'll send more when the wind drops enough to move safely. Don't be stupid about going outside. Pete Grady ladled the soup into tin cups and passed them around, and for a while the only sounds in the barn were the storm and the animals and 8 men eating in the particular grateful silence of people who did not expect to be taken care of. She's something, Pete said quietly, to no one in particular. Nobody disagreed. The storm ran for 3 days. On the second day they lost the outer fence along the north pasture, a quarter mile of it, just gone, post pulled or snapped by the wind and the weight of the drifts. On the third day they found 6 cattle dead in the east field, huddled together with their backs to the wind and still not enough. Hank found them when the storm finally broke, standing in the field with his hat in his hand like a man at a graveside, which was in its own way exactly what he was. Colt walked the fence line the morning after the storm ended, in cold that had dropped to 20 below, his breath visible from 6 feet away. He walked the full quarter mile of damage and did the arithmetic in his head, materials, labor, time, cost against the season, and did not let himself think about what the cattle would have been worth at spring market. He came back in and sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. Evelyn sat down across from him. She didn't say anything immediately. She waited. She had learned over months that some of Colt's silences needed filling and some needed space, and this was a space one. After a while, he lifted his head. The fence will take 2 weeks to rebuild, he said. In this cold, maybe 3. We'll need to buy materials from Henderson, which means I need to pull against the operational account. And the cattle, he stopped. 12 head total between the 2 fields, and the ones that made it through are going to take more hay than I have stockpiled for the rest of winter. I'll need to buy feed. How much? She said. He named a number. She didn't flinch. She got up and went to the study, opened the lockbox with her key, and came back with the ledger he used for ranch accounts. She sat down and opened it. Show me, she said. He looked at her. I'm your wife, she said. This ranch is both of ours. Show me where we are, and we'll figure out what we do about it. There was something in the word both that straightened his spine slightly. Not much, but enough. They sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, and they went through it. Income, reserves, outstanding accounts, the cost of materials, the cost of feed, the market value of what they'd lost. Evelyn was not a woman who'd managed ranch accounts before, but she was a woman who'd managed a household on a schoolteacher's salary for 8 years and understood arithmetic in the specific practical way of someone who has had to. She found 2 places where costs could be reduced without cutting the men's wages. She wouldn't touch the wages. She said it simply, and he didn't argue. She found 1 creditor whose terms could be renegotiated. She did the math on spring calving projections and what the herd would look like by June. "It's tight," she said. "I know. But it holds." He looked at the numbers. "It holds," he agreed. "Then we rebuild the fence," she said, "and we buy the feed, and we get to spring." He looked across the table at her. This woman who had come to his house with a small trunk and a bad situation, and had become, in 4 months, something he could not now imagine the ranch without. She was not unworried. He could see the worry in the set of her mouth, in the way she held the pencil. She was worried, and she was working anyway. "When did you learn to read a ledger?" he asked. "My father kept accounts for the school," she said. "He had me help him organize them when I was 12. He said everyone should understand where money comes from and where it goes." A pause. He said people who don't understand their own finances are always at the mercy of people who do. "Smart man," Colt said. "He was," she said. A small complexity moved through her face. "Is, probably. Still." She closed the ledger and stood, and Colt reached across the table and caught her hand. She stilled. He held her hand. Just that. Not trying to make it into something more, not filling the moment with words it didn't need. She stood for a moment at the table with his hand around hers. Then she turned her hand over and held his back. The rebuilding started 3 days later when the temperature came up enough to work outdoors without losing fingers. The men worked in rotating shifts, 2 out at the fence line, 2 warming in the barn, rotating every 2 hours. Evelyn kept hot food and coffee running through both locations, organized with a logistical precision that would have impressed a military quartermaster. She also, on the 4th day, put on her heaviest coat and went out to the fence line herself. Pete saw her coming and had the good sense not to say anything. She wasn't there to dig post holes. She was there because she'd been watching the supply line and realized there was a more efficient way to run it, and explaining the more efficient way was harder than just going and doing it. She reorganized the material staging and cut the walk time between the supply point and the work point by 1/3. She did it without making a production of it. She went back inside after 2 hours. That evening, Pete said to Hank quietly, in the bunkhouse, "She'd have made one hell of a foreman." Hank said, "Don't tell her that. She'll take your job." Pete looked at his soup. "I'm not sure that would be a bad thing." The fence came together by the end of the 3rd week. Not perfect. Some of the post angles were slightly off because the ground was still frozen hard enough to make setting them clean an exercise in stubbornness. But solid. Functional. Rebuilt from a destruction that could have been the end of the North Pasture operation for the season. On the day the last post was set, Colt stood at the fence line in the late afternoon cold and looked down the length of it. The light was the particular low amber of January at 4 o'clock, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The mountains in the distance were sharp and clear the way they only get in deep cold. Hank came to stand beside him. "Well," Hank said. "Well," Colt agreed. "Pruitt lost his whole south herd," Hank said. "All 400 head. Storm took them into the creek. He's done for the season. Might be done longer than that." Colt said nothing. 2 other operations on the East Range folded during the storm, Hank said. The Coopers and the Marlowe brothers. Marlowe brothers were already thin from last year. Cooper just didn't have the reserves. A pause. We're standing," Colt said. "Because of the ledger," Hank said. "Because someone went through the accounts and found the room that was there." Colt glanced at him. Hank's face was entirely innocent. "I heard things," he said. "The bunkhouse has thin walls. You were eavesdropping on my wife and me looking at the ledger." "I was sleeping nearby," Hank said, "and you 2 talk loud." Colt turned back to the fence. "She's good for this place," Hank said, without any of the indirection now, just plainly. "I know," Colt said. "I mean," Hank paused, and he was a man who never bothered with things that didn't need saying, so when he continued, it mattered. "I mean, she's good for you, specifically. The ranch would have gotten through without her, but you might not have. Colt looked at the fence line for a long time. I know that too, he said. The news that Dorothy Haynes had withdrawn her campaign of letters came through Margaret Aldrin, who came by the ranch in late January with more pie and a considerable amount of information. Dorothy had apparently found out about the Mercer Ranch's performance through the storm, the fence rebuilt, the operation intact, while simultaneously watching 3 other ranches fold. She'd also found out that a number of the ranch hands' families in town had been eating better since November because Evelyn regularly sent excess food from the kitchen with the men going into Silver Creek. She had not been told about this policy. Evelyn had not made it a policy. She'd just done it because there was food and there were people who needed it. Dorothy Haynes was not a charitable woman in the complex sense, but she was a practical one. She understood that the woman she'd been trying to run out of the territory had spent the winter quietly feeding people while Dorothy was writing letters, and she apparently understood that this was a kind of argument she couldn't win. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't reversed herself publicly. She'd simply stopped. She told Mrs. Pruitt, Margaret said, settling into the kitchen chair with her coat still half on, that she thought the situation had resolved itself appropriately. Evelyn stood at the stove with her back to the room. Appropriately, she said. That's the word she used. She means she's stopped fighting it because it stopped being a fight she could win. Yes, Margaret said. She doesn't actually think she was wrong. Almost certainly not, Margaret said cheerfully. But she stopped making your life difficult, which is the practical effect of being wrong without having to admit it. I'll take it. Evelyn turned around. She looked at Margaret. This woman who had shown up at her door with a pie and become, over a month, something she valued more than she'd expected to. Thank you, she said. For all of it. The witness, the information, the pie. She paused. The friendship. Margaret waved it off in the way of people who are embarrassed by gratitude but pleased by it. Someone had to have some sense about the whole thing. I'm glad it was me. Evelyn set 2 cups on the table and poured coffee. She told Colt that evening. He listened. Pruitt's gone for the season, he said. His operation might not survive, and Dorothy Haynes is finding it convenient to have a different opinion. He said it without satisfaction. That's a particular kind of justice. I don't need their approval, Evelyn said. She meant it. She'd stopped needing it sometime in the long, cold weeks of January, somewhere between the fence rebuild and the ledger, and the morning she'd gone out to the fence line herself. She didn't know exactly when, but it was gone now. The desperate hunger for it. The way it had scraped at her since she arrived in the territory. She was still aware of their opinion. She simply was no longer governed by it. I know you don't, Colt said. She looked at him across the table. He looked tired, the good tired of a man who has done work that mattered, not the hollow tired of months ago. He had lines around his eyes and his hair needed cutting, and his right hand still sometimes stiffened in the cold where the frost had gotten into it. Colt, she said. He looked up. She had been trying to find a way to say the next thing for 2 weeks. She'd tried several versions and discarded all of them. She'd decided eventually that there was no version that was elegant and that the cleanest thing was just to say it. I think I'm pregnant, she said. The kitchen was very still. His face moved through several things too fast to catalog. Something that started as surprise and became something else entirely. Something she'd only seen traces of on his face before. Something that had been under everything else for months. Something that was neither grief nor longing, but was related to both. When do you... I'm not certain, she said. But I think so. The signs are... She pressed her lips together. I think so. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, carefully, and put his hand over hers. She looked at his hand on hers. The hand with the scarring from the December cold. The working man's hand that knew what the land cost and paid it anyway. Are you all right? He said. His voice was low and careful with it. I'm not sure yet, she said honestly. He nodded. He understood honest. Whatever you need, he said. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, January was doing what January does. Cold and clear and enormous. The stars beginning to come out over the territory, over the rebuilt fence and the saved herd and the ranch that had held when others didn't. Inside the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch, a woman who had come here with nothing and a man who had been going through the motions of living sat at a table holding hands, and between them, quietly, without any certainty and without any fanfare, a future was beginning to take its shape. Spring came to the territory the way it always did. Reluctantly, in fits, 2 warm days followed by a cold snap that made you think you'd imagined the warmth entirely. But it came. By late March, the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and by April, the creek at the bottom of the north pasture was running loud with melt, and the cattle that had survived the January blizzard were moving differently, with the loose-limbed ease of animals that have stopped bracing against the cold. Evelyn was showing by then, not dramatically. She carried it close, the way some women do, but enough that the ranch hands had stopped pretending not to notice and had shifted, collectively and without discussion, into a kind of protective orbit around her that she found both touching and occasionally maddening. Tommy Briggs was the worst offender. He appeared whenever she was carrying anything heavier than a pot of coffee, materializing from some improbable location with his gap-toothed expression of helpful concern. She told him twice that she was pregnant, not injured. He'd nodded both times with complete sincerity and continued appearing. "Tommy," she said one morning in April, when he materialized at her elbow as she was moving a sack of flour across the kitchen. "Ma'am, I carried this sack of flour every week for 6 months before you decided it was a problem." "Yes, ma'am. So either the flour got heavier or your reasoning is flawed." He took the flour sack. "The flour got heavier," he said, and carried it to the counter, and she stood in the kitchen trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. Colt was not as visibly worried as Tommy. He was worried in the way he did most things, quietly, practically, manifesting as action rather than expression. He'd written to the doctor in Silver Creek before she asked him to. He'd fixed the bedroom floor where a board had been soft since winter. He'd ordered a particular tea from the general store that the doctor had mentioned as useful in the early months, and he'd put it on the kitchen shelf without comment, which meant she had to find it herself, which she suspected was intentional. He knew she received things better when they weren't handed to her directly. She used the tea. She didn't mention it. He noticed the level dropping and also didn't mention it. This was, she was learning, how they operated. In the parallel language of people who pay attention to each other, where half the conversation happens in things done rather than things said. It was not how she'd imagined marriage working, as a young woman in Ohio imagining it. It was better, in the specific way that real things are better than imagined ones. Less graceful, less articulate, but solid in a way that imagination never quite achieves. Her father died in April. James wrote to tell her a short letter, the same clipped efficiency as always, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before. He wrote that their father had asked about her in his last weeks, that he'd kept her last letter on his nightstand, that at the end he'd said her name. She read the letter at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up. The kitchen was cold, the fire not yet built. She read it twice and then she sat with it in her hands for a while. She was sad. She was also something more complicated than sad, grieving a man she'd already half lost before he died, mourning the version of the relationship that had never quite managed to repair itself all the way. Her father had apologized. He'd kept her letter. He'd said her name at the end. These were not nothing. They were also not everything she'd needed, and he was gone now, and the gap between what had been repaired and what hadn't was permanent. That was the particular cruelty of a death that comes after an incomplete reconciliation. You don't get the rest of the time you needed. Colt found her there when he came down. He saw the letter in her hands and he read her face in the way he'd learned to, and he built the fire first, because the room was cold and she needed warmth before she needed anything else. And then he sat across from her and waited. "My father," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it the way people mean it when they've lost someone too and know what the word actually contains. She nodded. She pressed the letter flat on the table. "He kept my letter," she said. "James said he kept it on his nightstand." Colt said nothing. He let that sit and be what it was. "I think I need to write to James," she said after a while. "Properly. Not just the information letters. Something real." She paused. "I don't know if he'll want that, but I think I need to try." "Then try," Colt said. "He might not answer." "He might not. You'll have tried anyway." She looked at him. "You make things sound simpler than they are." I make things sound as simple as they actually are, he said. You're the one who makes them complicated. Sometimes that's useful, sometimes it isn't. She looked at the letter. That's an annoying thing to be right about, she said. I know, he said, and got up to make the coffee. She wrote to James that afternoon. It took 3 drafts. The final version said what needed saying, that she was sorry for their father, that she hoped James was all right, that she was married now and living in Colorado territory and expecting a child in the summer, and that she would like, if he was willing, to know his wife. That she'd like, if possible, to find a way back to something. Not what they'd had before, because what they'd had before hadn't been enough. Something better, maybe, if they were both willing to do the work of it. She mailed it on Thursday, on purpose, the day Dorothy Haynes ran her auxiliary meeting. Old habits of avoidance died slowly, but she mailed it. James wrote back in 6 weeks. The letter was longer than any he'd previously sent. He introduced his wife Margaret properly, and Margaret added a postscript in handwriting that was rounder and warmer than James's. And the postscript said, I've wanted to write to you for a long time. James is not good at the first step of things. He's very good at everything after. Evelyn read the postscript twice and then read it aloud to Colt. He listened. She sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. Yes, Evelyn agreed. She does. The baby came in late July, a girl, which surprised Colt in a way that he couldn't have explained if asked, some assumption he hadn't known he'd made until it turned out to be wrong. They named her Clara, which had been Evelyn's mother's name, and which Colt had agreed to immediately and without negotiation, understanding instinctively that this was not a thing to negotiate. Clara was not an easy infant. She had opinions about sleep that ran counter to everyone else's in the household, and she communicated these opinions at high volume and without apology, which Hank said was absolutely going to be a problem, and Pete said was just her mother's personality starting early. Evelyn was too tired to argue with either assessment. The ranch hands rotated through a kind of ceremonial visiting in the first weeks, each of them finding reasons to come through the main house at odd times, managing brief and awkward proximity to the baby with the concentrated caution of large men handling something they're afraid to break. Tommy held Clara once, for about 90 seconds, with the expression of a man diffusing an explosive. He handed her back to Evelyn afterward and said, She's real small, with the gravity of someone reporting a significant discovery. Babies usually are, Evelyn said. Right, Tommy said. Yes, of course. He left quickly. Colt held his daughter with the particular stillness of a man who doesn't trust himself to move. He held her the way he held most important things, carefully, without pretending it was easy. The first night, when Evelyn was finally asleep and Clara was briefly, miraculously quiet, he sat in the chair by the bedroom window with her in his arms and looked at her face in the thin summer dark. He'd had this before, held a child, briefly, before Sarah lost the baby that would have been there first. He'd held that loss too, for 4 years, in the private interior way of a man who doesn't talk about the things that cost the most. He sat with Clara in the summer dark and let himself feel all of it at once. The grief that wasn't gone, the love that had come back anyway, the way life persists in moving forward even when you've decided you're done moving. He didn't resolve it. He didn't tie it up. He just held his daughter and let it exist. When Evelyn woke 2 hours later and found him still in the chair, she didn't say anything. She came and sat on the edge of the bed near him, and they were quiet together with the baby between them, and that was enough. The years after that moved the way years do when people are too busy living them to track their passage carefully. The ranch expanded, not dramatically, not all at once, but by the steady incremental growth of an operation run by people who understand that sustainability matters more than speed. Colt bought the parcel to the east when the Cooper family sold it at the end of their second bad year, and then the water rights to the North Creek, and built the herd back to 400 head by the time Clara was walking, and had decided that the barn cats were her particular domain. There were 3 more children, a boy they named William, then twin girls, Ruth and Anna, who arrived with the chaotic simultaneity of people who have decided to make an entrance. The house grew too. Colt added rooms in the practical way he did things, without ceremony, because the space was needed and so it was built. The Silver Creek that had watched Evelyn Hart arrive with nothing and decided she was damaged goods, watched her, over years, become something it hadn't anticipated. Not because she campaigned for it, not because she performed respectability at anyone, but because she did the work, the ranch work and the community work and the hard, invisible work of being a person in relationship with other people, consistently, without credit seeking, in the way that eventually becomes impossible to argue with. Margaret Aldrin's friendship deepened into the kind that survives distance and difficulty and the particular friction of two strong-willed women who don't always agree. They argued sometimes, genuinely, and remained friends through it, which Evelyn thought was the only kind of friendship worth having. She became, through Margaret, connected to the broader life of Silver Creek in ways she hadn't expected. Not accepted by everyone, never entirely that, but known, present, real. Dorothy Haynes died in 1884 without ever directly acknowledging that she'd been wrong about Evelyn Mercer. But she came to Clara's third birthday party, which Margaret had organized and which had somehow expanded to include most of the town. And she ate Evelyn's cake and said it was very good, and for Dorothy Haynes, Evelyn understood that was its own kind of apology. Tommy Briggs left the ranch in 1882 to start his own operation with a parcel of land he'd been saving toward for 3 years. He came to tell Evelyn first, before he told Colt, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and looking like a man confessing something. "You're not doing anything wrong," she said. "You're doing what you planned." "It feels wrong," he said, leaving. "It's supposed to feel like something," she said. "That's how you know it mattered." He looked at the table. "You taught me more than I expected," he said. "When I got here, I couldn't cook anything, and I couldn't manage supplies, and I didn't know how to think about a place as something worth caring for." He stopped. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't," she said. "I watched you," he said. "You came here with nothing, and you started caring for the place, caring for the people, without anyone asking you to, and it changed." He gestured vaguely at everything. "It changed what the place was." She looked at him. Tommy, who had eaten 4 biscuits on her first night in this kitchen and told her they were good, who had held Clara with the terror of someone diffusing explosives, who had kept his small journal and grown from 19 to a man she respected. "Go build your ranch," she said, "and take care of people when you have the chance." That's all it ever was. He came back with his wife 4 years later, and their 2 children played in the same yard where Clara had decided the barn cats were hers. And at the dinner table, Tommy and Colt argued about fencing methods with the comfortable heat of men who've earned the right to disagree. And Evelyn and Tommy's wife talked over their heads about everything else, and the evening was loud and imperfect and complete. Hank Delaney retired from the ranch in 1886 at 58 with arthritic hands and a stubbornness about it that meant the conversation had to happen 3 times before he accepted it. Colt gave him the small foreman's cabin at the south edge of the property with the deed in his name, because it was right, because Hank had earned it, and because Colt was not good at saying certain things directly, and this was the version of saying them that he was capable of. Hank stood in the cabin doorway with the deed in his hands and looked at it for a long time. "This is too much," he said. "No, it isn't," Colt said. "Colt, Hank," a pause. "You stayed when you didn't have to. You kept this place running when I wasn't capable of it. Stop arguing about the cabin." Hank folded the deed. He looked at the mountains. "She's the one who kept it running," he said. "I just did what she pointed me at." Colt didn't say anything to that, because it was true, and Hank knew he knew it. One evening in the early autumn of 1889, 11 years after a rancher had ridden into Silver Creek looking for a housekeeper and found something the whole town had thrown away, Colt Mercer sat on the porch of a house that had grown into something almost unrecognizable from the hollow shell it had been. Clara was 16, and at the far end of the yard, in a conversation with a young man from town that Colt was monitoring with the controlled tension of a father who has decided to trust his daughter's judgment and is finding it harder than expected. William was 13, and somewhere in the barn, with a book, having inherited his father's habit without inheriting his father's guilt about avoiding work to read. The twins were 10 and in the kitchen with Evelyn, ostensibly helping with supper, actually conducting some negotiation that he could hear the shape of but not the content. The mountains were doing what they did in September, going gold and purple in the late light, the aspens on the lower slopes already turning, the sky above them a particular clear blue that only happened in the weeks when summer was ending and hadn't admitted it yet. He heard the screen door, and Evelyn came out and sat in the chair beside him. She was 36 now. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd stood in that alley splitting firewood, and her hair had changed, and she was different in the ways that 11 years of hard work and hard weather and 4 children make a person different. She was also, he thought, had thought for a long time, had never been able to say without it coming out wrong, more herself, more fully, completely herself than the person who'd stepped down from his wagon that first day. They sat on the porch and watched Clara at the far end of the yard. "She's going to want to invite him to Sunday supper," Evelyn said. "I know. Are you going to be reasonable about it?" He considered. Probably not immediately. "Colt." "I'll get there," he said. "Give me a day." She looked at their daughter, this girl who had Clara's grandmother's name and her mother's directness, and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular combination of all of it, which was already becoming something neither of them had planned for, and both of them were unprepared to lose. "She'll be all right," Evelyn said, meaning more than just tonight, meaning something larger. "I know," he said, meaning the same. They sat together while the light did what it does in September, burning low and gold across 4,000 acres, 5,000 now, 5,000 and something. The land that had grown the way everything here had grown, by work and stubbornness and surviving the seasons that tried to end it. He'd thought about it before. About the single morning he'd ridden into Silver Creek with no particular purpose except escaping the silence of this house, and what that morning had become. He wasn't a man who thought about things in terms of fate or design. He thought about choices. He thought about what a person decided to do when they were afraid or tired, or when the easier thing was clearly in front of them. The easier thing, that morning, would have been to accept what the town had already decided about Evelyn Hart, to ride away from that alley and put the word out for a different housekeeper, a less complicated situation, someone without that kind of history. The town would have approved, Pruitt would have approved, Dorothy Haynes would have approved. His life would have been quieter and smaller and increasingly empty in the particular way of lives arranged around avoiding risk. He'd made a different choice. Not a brave one, exactly. He hadn't felt brave, standing in that alley. He'd felt tired and practical and faintly irritated at the way a town could decide everything about a person before that person had done anything. He'd offered her a job, that was all. He'd offered a woman a job because the work needed doing, and she could do it. Everything else had come from that. Evelyn's hand found his on the arm of the chair. She didn't look at him. She was still watching Clara, watching the mountains, watching the light change. But her hand was there, and he turned his over and held it, the same way they'd held hands at the kitchen table in January of 1879, in the cold, with the uncertainty still ahead of them. "William is going to burn supper if the twins don't stop distracting him," she said. "William is in the barn reading. He was supposed to be watching the potatoes." "The potatoes are probably fine." She stood up. She was probably right about the potatoes. She was usually right about the things that were going to go wrong before they went wrong, which was one of the more useful qualities in a person and one of the more irritating to be married to. At the door she paused and looked back at him. He was still sitting, looking at the light on the mountains, at his daughter at the end of the yard, at the fence line that had been rebuilt and held. She looked at him the way you look at something you've chosen deliberately, and chosen again every day since. Not with the softness of a feeling you've stopped examining, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who knows exactly what they have and what it cost. "Come inside," she said. "Supper's almost done." He got up. He followed her in. The screen door closed behind them with the small sound of a house that is lived in, and the mountains held their color until dark. And in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch, 4 children and 2 adults made the particular noise of a family that is imperfect and present and real. And outside the territory went on being large and indifferent and difficult, and full of exactly the kind of life that has to be chosen, deliberately, every single day, by people willing to make the harder choice when the easier one is right there in front of them. That is all a legacy ever is. Not the land, not the cattle, not the fence rebuilt 3 times against 3 different winters. Just a choice, made once, to offer something to someone the world had given up on. And the willingness, every day after, to mean it,